Sounds great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Like Arlen has said, it's nice if you've been with us for all 6 webinars. We've gone through a lot of information, and the finale is by far the one that will probably overload you cognitively by leaps and bounds. So sometimes I don't practice what I preach, but I want to make sure that I get you the information that you need to be successful and have something you can take back to your classroom or your profession as the administrator of the building, the next day. So we're definitely going to talk about cognitive overload today and how it's addressed through intrinsic and extraneous cognitive load. And so there's a lot of new research and theory about that. And it's starting to make a lot of sense to a person that probably lived her first years as an administrator cognitively overloaded every day. And perhaps maybe as a teacher with middle school and high school English students cognitively overloaded as well. But let's go ahead and have some conversation around this and see where we can start. Obviously, with the webinar, we'd like to just have some outcomes for everybody so you can kind of see where we're going. We're going to work on understanding that definition of intrinsic and extraneous cognitive load and how it applies to explicit instruction, right? Because our 6th series is still relating to explicit instruction. And if you've been with us, we've done strategies, interventions, the models that relate to explicit instruction, the research behind it. And so how we're going to apply this information as well to explicit instruction. And then obviously we want that educational leader to understand and apply the components of the memory system. And we're going to talk a lot about that. The older I get past 50 now, my memory system doesn't seem to be as sharp as it used to be. So I have to use some of these strategies myself. And then we want to think about those fundamental recommendations that come from cognitive load theory, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then it's real light stuff today, right? And then we'll understand through examples and uses and applications of what the cognitive load theory is. I cover this slide every session just to remind everybody, this work's based on the work of Dr. Anita Archer and Charles Hughes. And I was lucky enough when I was working at Boise State University as the Director of School Improvement and Special Education at the Policy Center there, we had the opportunity to be a trainer of trainer with Anita. She was in Portland, Oregon. We were in Boise, Idaho. And she had a lot of us from our region come over and be trained about her life's work. And I don't know if many of you have had the opportunity to see Anita, but if you haven't, she's on YouTube, obviously, because everybody's on YouTube. But she's gone across the country and has trained folks in this idea of explicit instruction and how valuable it is as a learning tool. And so that's where it all started. So I'd like to give her the credit where credit's due. And her work, I said again, and Dr. Hughes's work is what all this information is based on. For those of you that are just joining us, we cover this at the beginning every time just to anchor our thoughts in what is it that explicit instruction is. And, once we get through, you'll be like, oh yeah, I get it now. And so it's obviously a super powerful tool that teachers use to make sure students have this maximum possible amount of academic gain in a positive, respectful environment that promotes the success and nurtures their desire to learn, right? And I can honestly say I've worked in Illinois, the state of Illinois, through many programs, and I've had opportunities to be in the most successful schools and in the least successful schools, helping them and coaching them through some of the school improvement pains that they've gone through or gains that they've gone through, and understanding that not every classroom promotes that desire to learn or nurtures a respectful environment, right? We have some of those classrooms that kids struggle in, and so this is there just to kind of put things out in the open and say, here's what explicit instruction is. And so obviously it's systemic, it's direct, it's engaging, and it's success oriented. So for those of you just joining us, that's what explicit instruction is in a nutshell. Today's work, we're going to look through, and we always want to know if you want a new read. Oliver Lovell, he has kind of a love affair, so to speak, with cognitive load theory, and Sweller wrote this cognitive load theory in action. And so both of them have some information that I think is pretty pertinent to the work we're going to study. And then, just the idea of one's based off the other's, research. So these are the 2 researchers we're going to have throughout this information and throughout the study. And at the very end, there'll be a YouTube video for all the folks that like to watch videos and some additional resources that go back to this. But this is the work we're going to work through. So they talk about bulletproof definitions. And for us, anchoring our thoughts in this idea of what are the components of cognitive load theory that apply to explicit instruction, we really want to think through this bulletproof definition. And in regards to the elements of explicit instruction that we have, they're designed to optimize intrinsic load. And intrinsic load in our capacity is what we want students to learn, right? So in a nutshell, It's what we want students to learn, and to minimize extraneous load. And that's what takes students' attention away from critical learning, right? So optimize intrinsic, minimize extraneous. And so that's that bulletproof definition that we'll work on throughout the day. So just thinking of that quickly, and I'm just going to get you used to using the chat box. What are some examples of intrinsic load and extraneous load that you have used or observed in classrooms? I'm going to bounce back to this slide, and it's what we want students to learn. So something you wanted students to learn, give us an example, or give us an example of what takes students' attention away from critical learning, and drop that in the chat for us today. Nothing long, nothing too much. Just what do you think? What are some things that we want students to learn? Just a quick something. Or what is it that takes students' attention away? I got a list of those a mile long. So as soon as you all start dropping those into chat, we'll have that conversation a little bit. Somebody's going to play along with us, and I appreciate that. And so let's see. Hopefully I can see it. Clear objectives. Great, Amy. Thank you. Anchor charts, limit. Great. Anchor charts. Love it. Success criteria. Perfect. Cause and effect. Absolutely. What are some of those things that might be attention pullers, phones, announcement breakups? Absolutely. Thank you, Alex. Good Lord, that list goes on, doesn't it? It seems like it's never ending. So you totally get the gist. So, all right. You've got the bulletproof idea, what we want kids to learn and what takes their attention away from it. So great. So obviously our universal goal, and as Anita exaggerates things over and over and over, it's all about teaching and learning and teaching and learning and more learning. And so that's our goal for today. And that's our goal when we're designing lessons for students or anything that we do in our classroom. So the goals never change. It's all about teaching and learning, teachers and learning students, helping students learn. So this memory system, I thought the best graphic I could find is obviously a CPU or a memory board or something related to your computer. And when I think about that memory system, I think the memory system it's so interesting, right? So when I think of some of those things, the environment's part of that memory system, long-term memory and working memory. And there's been a lot of research on, obviously, environment. We've had that for years because it goes back to behavior, things that, in the environment that bother students. It could be internal things. It could be external things in their environment as well. Personal environment, school environment, thinking through those things. Long-term memory, and this is a big thing I always try to work on when we do these, but man, when you got 60 minutes to get a lot of information in, I'm a killer of the long-term memory. I try to put those things into long-term memory for you, but normally I have so much information that sometimes I have to remind myself, like, pause and ponder, that we'll have some of those opportunities coming up. And then working memory, there is so much new information on working memory, and it's interesting to think about. And it's probably things I didn't think about when I was planning lessons. I just was planning the lesson to make it interesting for students and to cover the information, the critical content that I needed to cover. But I hadn't thought about some of these things of how I might overwhelm students. And so we're going to talk through that and going to give you some examples and things that you can work with in your area, your specific content areas. So let's go ahead and keep going. Do you or any of your students struggle with any of these or all of these? What's it like when these items are out of sort? So the environment, long-term memory, working memory. Do you yourself, do your students, in the environment? We're just practicing using the chat box and to keep you engaged. Do you have what happens when this happens? Do you have students that have this problem? Do you have this problem? I know I have this problem. I used to be able to remember, yes, chaotic or lack of instructional routines. Absolutely, Sherry, that's exactly what happens. Anybody else out there have students or yourself? When one of these things are out of whack, it's definitely chaos. And it's a lack of instructional time. And I always tell everybody, we do things sometimes backwards, right? Loss of train of thought, absolutely. Sometimes I'm overwhelmed by the number of open tabs I have on my computer. Sleep deprivation, great, you guys are totally getting it. Because there's so much, right, anymore? And then let's not even throw your cell phones in, or the amount of distractions from social media, from Netflix, from Hulu, Google, whatever you got going on. So great, thanks you guys. And so when we think of those things, we're still kind of like in that constant, our screen's constantly open. Somebody said the tabs are open. That's sometimes how the day feels, doesn't it? So in that environment, we're looking at several things, everything outside of our minds, right? So God help us, there's so much outside of our minds, but when you start thinking about that, what does that really mean? And what does that look like in your classroom? And it goes back to the things we just kind of briefly discussed. videos. Kids have opportunities, social media, the internet, books. I don't know if many of them read books anymore. Maybe they read them on their Kindle. And trying to get them to read books is like pulling teeth some days. Journals, magazines, and information shared by experts and teachers. And that would be me trying to be the expert and help you through this and giving you so much information that you're like, all my tabs are open and I'm having a problem making sure my working memory works. And then that external source of information, right? So where else do they get information from that's, pushing in on them all the time? And then thinking about that, that unlimited scope of how many influencers are pushing in on kids in their environment. So how do we control that? And how do we kind of make that bubble in our classroom available to kind of clear out some of those distractors? And we'll talk about that a little bit too. So when we talk about long-term memory, that next component, we always think, long-term memories are where our memories are kept. It's what we've seen, we've experienced. They're life events. They're things that have gone on that, people can't take away from you, right? Their weddings, their births of children, their your graduation from college, different things like that. Your first job, maybe your first car you've purchased. Memories of progresses and strategies. And that starts to get into work, right? When you start to think about how to do something, or maybe it's a hobby of how to do something. And then memories of vocabulary and concepts. And, I was an extremely visual learner. And if I would see a picture of the word and obviously the word, I could store it away in long-term memory because I feel like I see things probably more photographically in my mind, and I can remember the page number of something versus a kid that's auditory, right? So memories of vocabulary and concepts. Maybe it's because we went and traveled abroad and I learned, Spanish as a second language. And it's those ideas of what something is. And then memories of factual information, facts and knowledge about something. I don't know who's my great Trivial Pursuit players out there who loves that game, who loves to participate in things like that. I know in our area, and I'm sure in everybody's area, there's certain places they have specific Thursday nights, trivia night at certain bars. And you can go and have teams and have fun. And it's maybe music trivia that night or whatever. But those are those facts and knowledges and how you cue those things up. I was always good at the card game match because I could cue up the match to it in my memory, where you put the card back down and match it up to another item. And then it's that internal source of information, right? So that long-term memory is what we put here, stored away, and we retrieve it out. And long-term memory is unlimited in capacity. So it sounds funny that it's unlimited, but it's unlimited as long as we can put it away there and anchor it and store it away into long-term. And there's things we do to push it from short-term memory into long-term memory. And normally making memories is the way to do that. You experience it, you feel it, you do those kinds of things that moves that short-term item into long-term memory. And then we're going to talk about this last piece here, working memory. And working memory is nothing different than, obviously, it's your site of consciousness, but it's where all the thinking is done. And Anita likes to stress it over and over. And it's where all the thinking is done and where all the thinking is done. And so when we think about that working memory, if we overload that working memory and it's where all the thinking is done, I wonder why kids struggle, right? Or sometimes why adult learners struggle when their webinar presenter gives them too much information and talks really fast, right? So that working memory is critical to making sure kids are successful, but it also takes us thinking through how we plan our lesson plans and how we, discover critical content and take kids through a lesson. And again, it's about thinking of all these things in place when we design these lessons. And working memory is limited. Have you ever had those days when you're like, holy moly, if one person tells me one more thing, my brain is going to explode? And that's why your working memory is just, the tabs are all open. Somebody said, the kids on their computer, perfect example. The tabs are all open in your brain and your working memory is limited and it starts to crash and shut down. Like, I can't do this anymore. And you might remember the first thing you did during the day, but that's about it. You can't remember anything after lunch. So that's why we want to kind of think through. Because again, what's happening? It's where we do all of our thinking, right? So if we're trying to get an important piece of content across to students and we're not activating their consciousness and where they think, or their working memory is totally overloaded because we provided too much information, then we got to rethink how we design some lessons to reach students, right? Because some people's working memory goes, in smaller increments than others. And some folks have a really good working memory and they're able to cue things up. And in fact, I'm sure in the disabilities categories that when people start looking at, they test for working memory to see how good kids can cue things up and remember things. Sometimes that is a disability if your working memory doesn't work the way it needs to. Again, I think the older I get, my working memory struggles. And sometimes it's just because, being present and being focused, sometimes I'm just not. So that's my fault as an adult learner. Okay, so when we think about those three components, the environment, long-term memory, and then we think about that working memory, how should this help guide your lesson plans? Any ideas? Like, what did you think through that instantly that you thought, I didn't think about that in planning lessons? Or maybe you have thought about it and you're good at planning those kinds of things. I find a lot of times though people forget about thinking, wow, I might have overwhelmed the kids with too much information initially. And so I'm just curious, anybody else have any experience with, how it might help guide your lesson plans and thoughts? I think Sherry here had a great piece too. She said chunking and checking for understanding is part of it, right? And limiting the number of learning objectives. Absolutely, Alex. Isn't it great to master a few than to master none? Because sometimes we just keep going on and on and on, and we don't know for sure, like, has everybody mastered that? And we're still kind of treading out there thinking everybody's got it until the quiz comes along. You're like, oh my God, only 20% of the kids got it. And so it goes back to all those components we've been working on in explicit instruction, when we design the lesson, when we engage students, when we have a rapid pace of instruction, right? So all these components that we've talked about in the past, all building up to this idea of, building these things into our lesson plans. It's trying to think through what this could look like and what strategies and pieces that we have related to explicit instruction really helps this. And so we're at a pause and ponder because I'm making myself do this for you guys. And those of you that are new with us, this is Bodhi, my lovely little French bulldog who travels along with me all the time. And he is a silent reflector. We call him the silent judger. He gives you a look and he just silently judges. And so in this part, when we pause and ponder, just take a few seconds to yourself, jot on a note. I always have a little notepad with me or whatever. Maybe it's on your phone, your iPad. Any ahas that you've had so far, because it's, believe it or not, we've been going and there's probably enough information that you're like, oh my God, I have cognitive overload. And so take some time, write something down, move something from short-term memory to long-term memory, because when we write it down, it normally does that. That's one of the strategies. And thinking through what questions do you still need answered so you can get it out of your brain and you can let that go so we can move on with content, right? So write down some of your ahas and what questions you still need answered. And so we're going to just have that pause and ponder second here. It's always that awkward silence. And then we hop on it and we get going again. So we're still going to talk about intrinsic cognitive load. And obviously, we're going to circle back around to it. It's what we want students to learn, right? And so when you're jotting down those ideas, you're like, okay, so I get it. Intrinsic cognitive load is simply what we want students to learn. And it's what we want them to think about, right? We want to have that higher thinking. We want to have them, developing their own ideas and problem solving and thinking through some things. And then obviously, it's what we want working memory to be occupied with, right? We don't want working memory to be occupied with their cell phone or with their Snapchat or their TikTok going on, right? We want those things. We've got to find ways to eliminate those interrupters in the environment. And then obviously we want to make sure it's what we teach. So if we can think of intrinsic cognitive load, it's what we teach. So ICL is what we teach. Move that to short-term memory to long-term memory in a nutshell. And that kind of makes it a little bit easier for everybody. So that intrinsic cognitive load is what we teach. When we go on, and we talk through the extraneous cognitive load, it's what draws students' attention and thinking away from what you want them to think about, right? It's those interruptions. Somebody had a really good list of interruptions over here in the chat box, and just thinking through, all the things that attention pullers, phones, announcements, breakups, crushes, sports, all that outside attention, right? That's that extraneous stuff that we're trying to work with as we're teaching in the classroom. And it's definitely connected to how information is presented to students. So it's the how we teach, right? It's your pedagogy, it's your delivery, it's how things work in your classroom, it's your routines. It's all those things that kids need for us to make sure they can wipe away some of those distractors. And sometimes there's things that we can't remove, but some things we can find supports and build strategies and scaffold things together to help them through some of those things that we can't control and they're extraneous, things that interfere in their lives. So the big ideas from extraneous and intrinsic is, and it's very common sense, intrinsic load plus extraneous load, it cannot exceed the capacity of our working memory if learning's to occur, right? So it's when our CPU crashes because we've had all this information given to us, and we've had all these distractors on the outside, and it's squirrel, squirrel, squirrel. And we can't really figure out what it is that we're trying to understand. And so we can move that stuff from working memory where we're thinking to that long-term memory, because we've got too much going on and we kind of bust our computer crashes. And so if intrinsic load plus extraneous load exceeds the capacity of working memory, right? If we just burn it up, cognitive overload results. And what happens? Kids shut down. They just don't turn in information. They kind of blow you off. They stare out into space. They disappear from the lesson. You've all seen that. You know what happens when cognitive overload results. But maybe you didn't think that it was a cognitive overload of why kids were doing the things they were doing in the class, right? I never thought of it that way. You know what I mean? I'm like, oh, they just weren't paying attention. Well, maybe I need to go back and be a little more reflective on my practice and think, did I overwhelm them, or did I not chunk some of these things in so we could kind of build on this new knowledge? Because remember, we want to make sure when we use explicit instruction, it's for new information, difficult information, or for struggling learners that haven't had that opportunity to have a real firm background knowledge on information. So it's not for every use, explicit instruction, but it's for those type of things that can definitely cause cognitive overload, right? New concepts, difficult concepts, kids that struggle with concepts, those kind of things. And so the idea of this cognitive load theory, it's just this recommendation that it's obviously, again, goes back to what we've said all along, optimizing intrinsic load and minimizing extraneous load. It's not rocket science. It sounds kind of crazy, but it's what we know, right? It's what we want to teach, what we have for kids, and then all those extraneous things that the environment, working memory, long-term memory, all those things that can get in the way if we don't think out how we plan out our lessons and how kids experience our classroom. So when we optimize it, it goes back to the idea of what explicit instruction things, our students supposed to think about as it relates to explicit instruction to optimize what they learn. And it goes back to the idea of that many sessions ago, we talked about focusing on critical content, right? I call it the baby bear effect. I don't know, you could call it whatever you like, but it normally goes back to the idea of it's appropriate curriculum, right? It's appropriate for them. It's the just right curriculum, like baby bear, this bed's just right. And trying to think through the idea that, if you introduce concepts that are 5 levels above a student, they're never going to master the information. So we really want to think about that, right? Because your brain power has so much capacity, right? We wanted that just right optimum piece where they can really take the information in and be able to think about the things that we're going to have them manipulate the information as it comes into their system with the questions and the way we design our lessons. And so when we think about this optimizing system, it's optimized through appropriate curriculum. Some of you guys may have had times when you've gone to your boss and said, hey, listen, this curriculum is horrible. This math curriculum, it's not meeting the needs of our students. It's not appropriate. It's from 1982. We don't even teach these things anymore. And so some schools have struggled with, making sure that they had materials that were appropriate or have written their own curriculum and they're supporting materials that have gone into it. It just depends on where you're at in the state and what's been done as it relates to a curriculum. And trying to think through the idea of optimizing appropriate curriculum with critical content, right? And being able to weed out the fluff and get to the stuff is basically what Anita normally says. So again, it's focusing on that critical content, and it's useful in the moment and it's useful in the future, right? Kids don't want to hear about the past. I know if you're a history teacher, you really don't want to hear that. We do want to teach history appropriately and teach about the past. But in this moment, the critical content that we're talking about is something that's useful in the moment and it's useful in the future. And sometimes the past is useful for the future, so we don't make those mistakes again, but in putting it in the sense of future. And then somebody had a great thing. They've obviously been with us and understand breaking down those complex skills and strategies and bodies of knowledge into smaller components. We chunk it, we break it down. It's some of the best reading strategies that I've ever seen. And same way for mathematics, science, whatever. You just can't go into the full-blown theory of relativity. You've got to teach some things that go along with it so kids get the pieces of the bigger picture. And then obviously that sequence plays a key here, right? I'm a logical linear person. I hate things out of order. And so I had teachers in my past that just, they were the circle person that I'm from point A to point B and they get there, but they're the circle, right? And it's not necessarily logical and linear. And sometimes it's appropriate that it is logical and linear, and sometimes it's not. But I was that kid that really struggled when people went around in the bird walk. And I was always the kid that was like, just get to the facts, Jack. I just need the facts. And so thinking through how do you sequence those skills logically, you obviously do easier skills before harder. You want to make sure those high frequency skills before low frequency skills. And you want them to make sure that they know the prerequisites first, and similar skills are separated. The prerequisites first was pretty important. And I've talked about this before. And if we have a new group of folks, or the same group of folks, I apologize. But we had done a study and had worked with students out, and when I was out in Idaho, and we noticed that, like every kids across America, middle school kids really struggled with fractions. Who am I kidding? High school kids struggled with fractions. And we went in and we kind of looked at some things, and there were some key components that were missing from kids, skills that they didn't have. They had no understanding of number sense, and they didn't understand numbers on a continuum and understand where things took place. And this was like in middle school grades, right? These are prerequisites they should have mastered earlier, but for whatever reason, they didn't understand that. And so when we looked at that, we were like, that would cause you not to be successful with fractions. And so when we think of those things, it kind of goes back to finding these prerequisites first. If kids are struggling on one of your concepts, what are the concepts that are broken down that they haven't mastered, right? And so what prerequisite skills do they need to master the content or the skill that you're trying to get through that day? If those are missing, we've got to back shoot and do, we call it, it's a horrible thing to say, but we call it a SWAT team. We go in and we kind of shore up those gaps and do a quick study for students. It could be just a pull out time that we did 1 to 2 weeks of a unit to make sure that they got number sense straightened out. And, a lot of times that cleared up their issues. And so making sure we understood that, those were the things that we wanted to make sure we were able to optimize, because if not, these prerequisites really stall out that idea of being able to think critically, because you don't have that skill to queue up. And then when we think down here, here's a perfect example that will give you the idea in math, an example of breaking down complex skills. So it's relationships, fractions, decimals, and percents. And so the first one could be write decimals as fractions, write decimals as fraction and mixed numbers, write fractions as decimals, write fractions and mixed numbers as decimals. And so it's all these logical steps, simple to difficult, and thinking through those things. Here's a vocabulary example, and this is a reward strategy. So it would be, the overt strategy, highlight the prefixes right here, highlight the suffixes at the end, underline the vowels. They've done that, say the parts of the word. And so reconstruct, and they would go through, say the whole word and make it a real word. So they would work through that. And that would be a strategy that you want to do just to kind of break some of those new things down. And these vocabulary things are super simple. They're quick, but they also give kids the idea that words mean something, and that has an application to when they're reading and when they're working in different content, and how we as teachers need to remember there's probably a lot of vocabulary we have to instruct on. We can't just assume, or Anita calls assume aside, that kids know vocabulary coming in our classroom. That's kind of our job. And so we've gotten to another pause and ponder, and we kind of roll through a lot of these things just because we're tight on time. But through this last section, we talked a lot about simply thinking through, examples of all this and going through that optimizing intrinsic load and what it looks like and how it's important when we're doing that appropriate curriculum. And like I said, the baby bear effect, and how you might work to optimize intrinsic load in your classroom. And this is just one of the math examples and a vocabulary example. But what do you think about how do you optimize intrinsic load in your classroom? And have you thought about it? Maybe you haven't, maybe you have, and that's neither here nor there, but this is that opportunity to think about it and think about, maybe there's some things I need to think about when I'm designing my lesson that I hadn't thought about before. Maybe I'm not working on that smallest to most difficult idea of the concept. Maybe I just introduced too many concepts. Maybe whatever it is that we've covered, we're not optimizing that intrinsic load. And so what ahas did you have, and what questions do you still need answered? And just kind of write those down in your notes so you can continue to keep thinking through some things as we work through this. And since you don't have the PowerPoint in front of you, you'll get it at the end. You can go back and check these things out and say, okay, I'm going to read through this. And I have my pause and ponder to kind of understand where we were at and think through what is it that I still needed to know, or ahas, I didn't know. I didn't even think about optimizing, blah, blah, blah. And so we always run out of time on these webinars because I try to give you too much. So this time I made a note to myself, and here slides 33 through 40, well, this one included, it's more additional examples. I'm not going to cover each example today, but when you get the PDF at the end of the thing, Arlen will ship it to you. And then you can go through these. There's some explicit things on here that you can kind of go back and look, and I'm going to scroll through them. So there'll be a reading example for you. There's an ELA example, and it talks about how to apply this idea of, optimizing intrinsic load. It's social studies example. There's writing examples. And, I always go back to this too, this idea of the writing example. Oh, that's just English language arts, or that's just the, that applies to all content areas, right? We're all in this together. We all have to think through, kids need to write in every classroom. It makes it easier, but what are the things we agree upon? And I found this example really breaks things down. If you're not a writing teacher, it kind of gives you the formula to how to make things a little bit better if you're doing assignments in writing in class. And maybe you pair with the writing teacher and your grade levels they work on the writing part of it and you work on the content part of it, but whoever that looks like. So there is those writing examples, and then all content areas, things that apply. And that we're going to talk a little bit about. So I think it goes back to that idea of a suicide. And a lot of times we pre-teach difficult vocabulary, don't get me wrong, because it tells us there's so many things that we need to cover at the beginning of the unit that we're covering, right? And so when we pre-teach that vocabulary, we pre-teach knowledge. We should think through that. We should pre-teach characters and pre-teach timelines. You think, oh my God, I don't have all this time to pre-teach, but there's some things that we'll cover to show you that there's some easy ways to do that. They're pretty quick, right? And so let's go ahead and take a look at one. So here's a quick pre-teaching vocabulary. This obviously is related to mathematics. It's lines and transversals. And here's all the vocabulary that's going to be covered in this section that we're working on. Here's one of their examples that they give as, how they've pre-taught their vocabulary. The things in red are the new words that they're covering. These ones that are in black are ones that they're going back to because they've already introduced it previously. And then they anchor it in context. So kids can get it through context clues and additionally through a graphic that helps them anchor that thought into like, okay, I can cue up that graphic in my mind and that's what it looked like. So, okay, those are the kind of corresponding angles. Here's the congruent angles and things like that. So just an example of how to pre-teach vocabulary. And again, these were the ones they worked on in the previous section. I'm going to skip that pause and ponder for you because I think that's a little too quick for us. But let's think of some things here, pre-teaching. So when we go back and we take a look at examples after the webinar, we're going to have a few more things on here for you to take a look at. And these will be the following slides, again, because sometimes I have an overwhelming desire to make sure everybody's content area has an example, or at least some examples that different grade levels can take a look at and apply it to themselves. So I have a tendency to include too many for you guys, but I just feel like, oh, there's just one thing that they can take away. That's my intent to make sure, but I'm trying not to overload you cognitively this time. And so we're going to look at a couple slides, but then again, we're going to have extra slides for you to take a look at. So when we talk about this concept, we pre-taught vocabulary, let's pre-teach knowledge. It's obviously informative text we're going to do on the Panama Canal. We're pre-teaching it, and we're going to do things like, where's Panama? What's a canal? Why was Panama chosen for a canal between the Pacific and the Atlantic? When was the Panama Canal constructed? What are the locks? How the locks work? Why is the Panama Canal important? So you're getting the gist, right? We're pre-teaching and trying to engage them and trying to see what background knowledge they might have, right? Because we need to activate their prior knowledge so we can kind of suck them in and get them interested in the content. And we do this through different ways. We ask the questions, we might put photos up, we might do whatever it takes because we know our students best of how they learn. And we might use things like character maps, right? So I don't know about you, but sometimes this is Macbeth and Shakespeare he had several characters, several roles, sometimes two characters that played the same character, right? And so when we look at this is the pre-teaching a character map. And here's an example of one using Macbeth for all the high school English language folks out there. And it's interesting. I kind of like these because it keeps track of who the characters are, what maybe their other name might be called, what their role was, who they were in relationship to everything, and what their key things were, right? So it's basically a one-pager character map, Cliff Note. And again, here's another way to teach characters, the Lord of the Rings for all the folks that are out there. And again, we call it Cliff Notes, but at least this way it kind of keeps kids, again, we're trying to prevent cognitive overload. It's in a graphic formation. It's got a little bit of information, but it's got the pertinent information, right? The critical content that we want them to know. And again, those timelines, it's important for kids to keep track of things like when did something occur? Gosh, yes, kids, I don't know, it's just because I'm getting older that I say something they don't even know what I'm talking about. So, it's official that you're old. Like I said, something about Top Gun. And until the Top Gun came out this year, they had no idea what I was talking about. And I was like, it's official, I'm old. But now I'm not old again because they know what Top Gun is. So when we think of pre-teaching in history and anything that we're doing, there's events, there's things that take place. It's good to timeline it out, right? So kids can physically see how we move through and why it was important, right? So, I would hope people know that World War II came after World War I, but I'm telling you, we could ask people and that may not be the case. So, when it's important that there's a lot of times and a lot of dates, putting that in a timeline format, look how much easier it is than to read paragraphs on it. Because then that way it's, again, freeing up that working memory and we're able to work with the information we have. So when we think about that, we've optimized the learning in the cognitive theory, right? Now we're trying to minimize the extraneous load. And I'm a behaviorist, right? So I like to make sure that I understand for all you guys doing all your positive behavior intervention supports and all the information that you're pre-teaching kids, how to behave, the steps in the classroom, routines, even the first days of school. Some of you guys might have used Harry Wong and done his first days of school type of things. Those are the behavioral type things that we can minimize for extraneous load. But there's so many things that get in the way that are that outside noise that disrupt the class. And some things, like I said, we can control, and some things there's just, we have to work through with students of where they're at. So trying to minimize this, it's some things that we can take students' attention away from what we want them to learn, right? And anymore, there is so many things that take their attention away. But again, how do we control it in our classroom and what we can control? Don't try to boil the ocean. There's only so many things you can control in this world. And again, let's think through how those explicit instruction components minimize things that take students' attention away from what we want them to learn and think about, right? So, and again, it goes back to what we've talked about. It talks about the idea of effective design and delivery of instruction. So how critical and how important it is when we design the delivery and the lessons that we provide students. So let's kind of talk through this. That extraneous load being minimized is through intentional design and delivery instruction. I think somebody even said that earlier, it's how we design our lessons and how we think about those things. And perhaps that's why I used to get so aggravated that our bosses would want to see our lesson plans for the week. First off, I'm not sure my boss could have at the time. And when I started teaching, I'm not so sure he knew what he was looking at. It was just futility, right? We were just turning these things in. But now that the research has come out and the importance of, really being prepared and planning lessons, and I can't imagine now how more critical it is when I read the research and all this and think about what is we can build in to kind of deflect all the noise from the outside. And obviously it's through intentional design and delivery of instruction. And then designing those organized, focused lessons and thinking about the kids we serve in our classroom. Every class is different. So sometimes we design a lesson or, say we teach English 1 and we teach it first, second, and third period. Well, first period might be okay, but second and third period, no way will that lesson work. So we have to kind of tweak it and keeping in mind the student groups we serve. And this is all basic. Again, we've covered this in the past. So I just dropped it in to kind of anchor in our thoughts, but in our openings, obviously, attention, review, preview. Those are the big things we want to be keeping in mind that relate to our explicit instruction and just good instruction. And then obviously there's the body of what we're doing and the closing, review, preview, independent work. And what do we say? A lot of times we get this part right, but the bell rings or we have to switch classes or kids have to go to art or somebody's getting pulled out of class. And this review, preview, independent work really struggles. And it's a critical part of our lesson design and thinking through how we really can see, checking for understanding and making sure kids are getting it. And so those are the things that we keep seeing come up when we have those conversations. And when we talk through that body piece, we want to provide that instruction that's intentional, direct, and explicit. I tell everybody, when we design courses, even online, I'm like, what are the directions? It needs to be that simple. Like people need to say, okay. And I call it almost monkey proofing it, but it's almost like a student needs to look at it and know what the directions are. So directions need to be on everything. And I think sometimes we get away from working in our class. We're like, oh, they get it. No, we need to put that on there. The direction says blank, and we think through that. It's intentional, it's direct, and it's explicit in our directions. And I think sometimes we forget about those things being those three components. And again, if we think about that extraneous load piece, and minimizing it because we're working on this intentional design and we're working on how we deliver our instruction. We definitely have the other folks that had remembered too that the lesson begins with a clear statement of the lesson's goals. And I was always amazed in schools that were high functioning, high performing. You go in there and you could ask a kid, hey, what are you working on? They tell you what the goal for the day was. I was like, what? Now, when I worked with the schools that were in school improvement status and at the lowest, say 5% of the state, I would go in. I mean, and I was lucky if the teacher knew what the goal of the day was, right? So it's just it makes a difference in trying to think through, because you know what happens? If you don't fill the void, they will fill the void in the classroom when you don't have content or a good delivery, and the void that they fill will not be a good day for you, right? So kids only get away with what we allow. And sometimes that all begins with making sure we have intentional design and delivery with that limit of extraneous things interfering. And so if we want to talk about, giving you an example, these bulletproof definitions, we talked about one when we opened, and it's just simply a definitions of one sentence summary of the key concept or idea teachers trying to convey. I always tell principals too, like when I'm working with principals on leadership things, it's like, what's your elevator speech, right? What's your quick thing? What are you guys about? The same way on this is a bulletproof definition. It's like, what is it in a nutshell that you can tell us? So this is the example given. It's a history lesson, and we're wanting to analyze the causes of the Cold War. And so the bulletproof definition example that I can give you is the Cold War as a period of tense competition between 1941 and 1991 between the United States and the Soviet Union without direct war between the two powers. Now, technically, I think we probably go back and edit that 1991, comma, and it's kicking up again, but perhaps that was a bad example to use, but you get the gist of what we're saying here is analyze the causes of the Cold War, right? And still the Cold War is Cold War that we're defining it as through 1991. And so here's the pieces that we want to think through. So how we minimize that is giving bulletproof definitions. It's kind of concise, to the point, and gives the information that kids need. And it's minimized through intentional design and delivery of instruction. So a lot of times we forget this skill too, reviewing prior knowledge and skills and knowledge before beginning instruction. I remember teaching a class. I was an observer of a classroom as the administrator, and I went in and it was like deer in headlights, and it was kindergartners. And I think the teacher assumed that all the kids in the classroom had been to the zoo. The story was about the zoo. A lot of kids hadn't been to the zoo. And so it broke my heart, one, that they hadn't been to the zoo and didn't know what a zoo was. But the teacher just assumed that all kids had those experiences. And so sometimes, again, like Anita says, we commit a suicide, and we assume that kids have these background information that they really don't. So sometimes we have to preload and front load some things to make sure that we're reviewing those prior skills and knowledge before we start, because we normally have varying groups of, instruction, different levels of learning in the classroom. Some learners are in level, let's say, just as an example, level 3 all the way up to 25 in a classroom. So, you think through the different learning skills and how important it is. It's one of the biggest things for reading, for sure, is making sure you activate prior knowledge. And it's kind of hard to do that. And I think most of you teach reading. So as you go through, if you don't introduce those prior skills and knowledge, it's kind of hard to activate their reading comprehension and engage them in the reading. And then we continue to think about some things. Like, are we providing step-by-step demonstrations, right? The I do of the I do, we do, you do model, and guided practice and support practice. And we use clear and concise language, and that idea of clarity, consistent, and unambiguous wording. Some people are really good about this, right? They can, I tell you what I just told you earlier in the lesson is I just need the facts, Jack. And some people can do that great, and some people can't do that, right? And so you're like, oh my gosh, she said 5,000 words and only 3 words mattered. And so thinking about that clear and concise language is critical when you're trying to deliver some of this information. That's why I try to really stick to the slides and these short little snippets. And so I try not to overload you in that regard, but normally by the time we get through, it's information overload. When we're talking about that skill and strategy piece as it relates to that extraneous piece, the concepts that we've talked through every session that we've had, it's the I do, we do, you do component of explicit instruction, right? I do it, I'm demonstrating it, we do it, it's guided practice, and you do it, and I'm checking for understanding that you got it. And so that piece is overlaid over the top of everything that we plan in our lesson plans, especially as it relates to skill or strategy. And then when we think about how we deliver facts and knowledge, right, and this explicit instruction of facts and knowledge and how we get to that point of getting that into our lesson, we want to know that we, attend, intend, rehearse, retrieve. And that's all those parts that when we're looking specifically that we're teaching facts and knowledge, are we doing these kind of strategies built into it? Are we attending, intending, rehearsing, and retrieving that information? So it becomes kind of a brisk pace and sing-songy in a sense that we're able to cue up those things that we think are critical knowledge and critical facts in that lesson. And how do we do that? And using those explicit instruction strategies. I don't know that everybody's been taught how to teach vocabulary appropriately. I think people that have majored in English language arts or whatever have had a lot of courses in how to teach vocabulary in that, and some folks have in other content areas, but this is kind of a simple way of doing it and simply going through it, and it helps every content area, right? So we simply introduce the word's pronunciation because sometimes kids can't say it right. I was a middle school English language arts teacher, and we were reading, and this will never leave my mind. It was Colonel Chihuahua. And the student said, Colonel Chihuahua. And I thought to myself, okay, we should have done some pronunciation prior to. I committed a suicide. It was not Colonel Chihuahua, it was Colonel Chihuahua. And understanding that some kids don't have that ear training, so to say, of hearing the word itself. They just need our help, and we all work through it, and we all share the idea of here's how we pronounce the word. Step 2 is obviously introducing the word's meaning. We can do it many ways, right? And how you do it in context within your content, and how it sticks with it. I kind of thought through some of those things when you're trying to make sure it's quick and brisk, but at the same time, maybe it's a picture that anchors the word that you're trying to teach the meaning of, and kids can learn it that way. But there's so many ways to teach that word meaning. And sometimes it's just by showing the definition. People see it that way. Sometimes it's hearing the auditory kids that need to hear it. And sometimes, like I said, it's a picture that helps them through it and in context. And that step 3 is illustrating the word with examples. And as Marzano always says, non-examples are just as good as the examples, right? So here's what the word's not, and here's what it is, depending on how difficult the content is, because sometimes it's easier to think of a non-example than an example. And then as we go around, we check for understanding, make sure the kids are getting it, and making sure they're getting the idea of the vocabulary, because it's pretty hard to go through a unit and not have that information ready to go for students. And it goes back to repetition, routines. You want to know how to break that environmental barrier, those things that push in. It's the routines that save your life, right? If you're one of those people that love routines, God bless you, you probably got your room running like a well-oiled machine. It's those that struggle with routine and being explicit about what the expectations are in the class, as in, this is how we sharpen our pencil. I know it sounds silly, but we don't sharpen a pencil when I'm talking. We sharpen a pencil in between class, in between discussions, whatever that routine is. But it's that time you spend at the beginning of the year thinking through all those routines, and you teach that in that first week or 2 of class, because it saves you at the end, right? Because if not, all that external stuff is always kicking in. They're on their phones, it's chaos. And again, it's those classrooms that struggle. It's normally classroom management or just routines that lack in there. The kids don't know what your expectations are. And let's face it, kids don't know how to behave, right? We have to teach them what we expect, how to behave, because a long time ago, we thought kids, again, we assume kids know how to behave when they come into our classroom. They're freshmen and they don't know how to behave, or they don't know how to have study skills. It's things we have to assume we need to teach. And it stinks sometimes to have to teach things we thought they knew, but that's the only way to get through this and make sure they're successful and that they feel comfortable in our classrooms learning. And so we think through, again, routines. So when we continue through, we want to think of that last bulletproof definition. Obviously, these elements of explicit instruction, they're designed to optimize intrinsic load. It's what we want students to learn. Optimize intrinsic load, it's what they learn. And minimize that extraneous load, it's what takes students away from critical learning. And again, we've talked about all those things. So you guys can make a long list of that, depending on how long you've been in the profession. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what takes students' attention away. And that was one of the things I thought when we were looking at redoing some programs. It was the outside detractors that I had teachers make a list. Give me a list of things that distract you during the day and send them to me. And then let's talk about it. And we had a staff meeting, we talked through it, we ranked the ones of importance. And the things that I could take away that were distractors, I took away immediately. As the administrator of the building, I needed to remove those things because you didn't need those in your classroom. I needed to take those away. For example, we had a reading that took place from 9 to 10:30 in the morning. We told parents, hey, do us a favor, especially in elementaries, do us a favor, don't take your kids out from, make your appointments after lunch. which didn't always make everybody happy. But if our reading scores went up, everybody else's scores seemed to go up as well. And I appreciate that. We wanted kids to learn to read. And so we realized there are certain things as the administrator I could take away from teachers that cause them problems of that environment that they couldn't control, but I could help control. So thinking of those things, maybe making a list and having those conversations on what takes students away from learning. Because I know you guys had some great things that, I at the cell phones alone, I just think, hoi, hoi, hoi. So when we get to the end here, what ahas did you have in thinking about optimizing your intrinsic theory and then minimizing the extraneous things that get you in trouble, that pull you away from what's taking place in the classroom? What ahas did you have? What questions do you still have? What are your thoughts on all this, actually, because we're towards the end here, and then we'll have some time for some conversation. And think through that and just jot that down to yourself and thinking through, let me think about what that looks like. Because again, you'll have this hour with me today. I'll provide it like a fire hose to you and give you all this information. And then a couple of things I hope you take away is, what we teach and how they learn and trying to not, eliminate what the distractors are, which I think it's, again, pretty common sense. But going back to those examples that were provided and specific to content, when the PDF comes to you guys at the end here, you can go back and review it and think through those things. What are those things you got ahas about and things you still have questions about and still need answers? Because sometimes that lets you take a deeper dive on something and think through it. Or even if you're new to today's webinar, you go check out one of the other webinars, because they all do build up to this point, this being one of the, I would say, more difficult pieces that we've covered. But it goes back to just common sense things that we're trying to put in order and clarify some things for you and just give you time away from the school setting to think about, do I overload kids' cognition? Do I overload them cognitively? I mean, I overload people, and I always would tell staff, like, I had high expectations for my staff, and I probably did overload them. And if you cry, it was a good way to cry. It's that you're learning. It's not crying because you're upset, right? It's because we're stretching you cognitively, and that we wanted you to get the most out of, the best you could be. And so again, it's not to make kids cry, but it is to stretch them and make them really think in the classroom. And how do we avoid some of those distractors and really think to ourselves, what is it that I put into my lesson? The questions that I ask, the pre-teaching that I do, how I teach vocabulary, things like that make a difference, and make a difference in how much we retain in our brain and in our working memory. So we are successful in the classroom, because again, we all process things differently. In the end, I always try to give you guys some resources. And again, in Oliver Lovell, Cognitive Load Action and Theory, here's a YouTube video on him, and he talks through it. So you can have that video component piece too. I won't play that for you because you'll get the full aspect of it and have that time to go and take a look at it yourself. And then we actually try to wrap up with time if anybody has questions and has some ideas. It's 5 till I normally have so much content for you guys. I apologize, but I'm always here. And I know today Arlen's tight on time. He's got a thing going on as well. And I just wanted to say that we can take some questions real quick because we have about 5 minutes. If anybody has any burning questions, thoughts, ideas about the 6 sessions, maybe some of you guys have made it with us all the way through, and trying to think through, what your next steps are. How do you keep, everything in order so you can remember this? Because, right, you're learning this throughout the year. And when do you get to apply this? Are you holding off till next year to put some explicit instruction into place? Are you trying to think through these things? And again, some of you guys have had all 6 sessions with us, but you can go back and check on the webinars. And anybody that's just visited with us for today, I want to thank you guys for taking time out of your day. I know it's very busy in your world and trying to give you some pretty heavy cognitive things in a short amount of time, but hopefully with some examples for you to take back and kind of think about. It just gives you time away to think about these things, the pause and ponder. Maybe you still have some of those questions. My email's at the top here, and I'm happy to work with you guys on any of those questions that you'd like to know a little bit more about. And, I do explicit instruction in a longer depth in trainings. If you have, if you're an administrator and want to work through making in person or an online course for your class or for your teachers that you have for professional learning opportunities, I'm happy to do that as well. And it's just kind of coming to a close for all this. I can't believe 6 sessions. We've gone through a lot of material. And so hopefully you'll all gain something from this. Sherry says, I'm working with middle class ELA and math PLCs in the next 2 weeks to identify the most impactful strategies. I wanted to read it here. I love when this bumps up on me. And routines. Thank you for all this great information. Great. I'm glad it's timely, Sherry. That's what's important, right? Alex says, thanks very much for sharing the info. I've been to every session. I thought you had, Alex. So glad you've been with us. I am opening in terms of making my instruction more explicit and therefore more effective. Excellent. I'm happy to hear that. It is that time to reflect, though, on your practice so that we don't give each other enough time sometimes. And like I said, I'm just as guilty when I do these with you guys because I give you so much information. But I just want to make sure, because, you know, if you notice, we have people all the way from pre-kindergarten all the way to high school on here. And we also have teachers, special ed teachers. We have counselors, we have support staff, we have administrators. So we want to make sure that everybody in the group walks away with something so they haven't given up their hour, which is precious to them. And they walk away with something that hopefully triggers a deeper thought or something that you can apply in your classroom or in your leadership opportunities in your building. Oh, Sandra, great. She's attended all 6, even logged in from vacation in Florida. Oh my gosh, Sandra, gold star. Woo! You are dedicated. Well, I really appreciate that. That's a very nice compliment that you took your time to come and join us from that. That is fantastic. I appreciate it. And I hope you're having great weather and enjoying your spring break. Anybody else out there?
And if anybody has anything they'd like to share out verbally, you can raise your hand and I will enable your microphone to speak with Gina directly. But of course, chat is always open too. So any final thoughts, questions, please put them into chat. Any thank yous to Gina. We really appreciate you here at the Illinois Principals Association, Gina. And excited to know that not only will this recorded series be available, but we are working on an on-demand version of the Explicit Instruction series that we will put into Ed Leaders Network as well, so that people can access it anytime, get the full program that she has shared out here live today.
And like Arlen said, I appreciate all of you guys. It's hard to give an hour up every month, and you guys have been great. So I'm so thankful that you've done this, and I hope you've learned a lot. I know I have, and so it's great to be with professionals like yourself, learning more and looking forward to things in the future. Have a great wrap up to your school year. I know it's March, but it's only 2 more months. We're almost there, 3 more months at tops, and there's light at the end of the tunnel.
All right, thanks everybody for typing into chat and thanking Gina. You are free to log out of the Zoom room. If you hover down in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see a big red leave button that will log you out for today. And I will be following up with the recording, evaluation, and PowerPoint links tomorrow morning. So be on the lookout for those things as well. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day and a great rest of the school year. Thanks, Gina.
Thanks, Arlen. Talk to you guys later. Have a great year.